bit early on, though. Today in The Athletic, I thought it was pretty cool. They did a story, Max Olson along with Andy Staples. If you don't have a subscription to theathletic.com, that's fine. But it really is good. They tied in the Stanford and USC game on September the 11th. Clay Helton was fired after losing to Stanford 42-28. Since that time, they charted every single coaching change based on that game and Helton being fired and what it meant to USC, which eventually affected Oklahoma, which eventually affected Clemson, which eventually affected Ole Miss, which eventually affected US. It's unbelievable. I sent Jack, I sent you an image, but even putting it up, it's going to look like the hieroglyphics. You can't read it. It's too crowded. But here's a little bit of a taste of this. Not sure if you saw this or not. Scott Lem is pretty sure he saw some of the Stanford-USC game on September the 11th. Pretty sure he read the news that a few days later, Clay Helton was fired. Lem is the head coach at Bridgewater College, a Division III school in Northern Virginia that plays Old Dominion Athletic Conference. Football staff of 8. Note that the staff total in previous sentence does not include the modifier. The on-field staff is a support staff. On the day USC fired Helton, Bridgewater offensive line coach Kyle Rigney lined the practice field in addition to his football duties. He barely gave a passing thought that was what was happening in L.A. Helton's firing, though, tipped the first domino in an array that eventually would stretch across the country. USC hired Lincoln Riley. Oklahoma hired Clemson defensive coordinator Brent Venables. Venables hired Ole Miss offensive coordinator Jeff Levy. Ole Miss then hired Lane Kiffin. Ole Miss then hired South Florida offensive coordinator Charlie Weiss Jr. USF hired head coach Jeff Scott hired West Virginia receivers coach Travis Trickett to replace Weiss. West Virginia head coach Neil Brown hired Coastal Carolina receiver coach Tony Washington to replace Trickett. And then eventually now Graham Harrell. Coastal Carolina's Jamie Chadwell moved tight ends Malcolm Dixon to receivers. It's on and on. One job, the USC job, affected what now has become what looks like an algorithm of how many coaches.
29 coaches, all told?
Yes. Jack, did you get that image? You can't read it. It's impossible to read. But isn't that crazy? And it includes even Division III schools that were affected by this as well. One coach, one hire.
Yeah, I mean, it set off a chain of dominoes. Kind of hard without, kind of having the visual representation for folks to kind of grasp it. But, yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. It set off a chain of dominoes, and a lot of chaos happened. So thank you, Lincoln Riley, for making the move and creating all that chaos. But, yeah, it all boils down to him. And, but if it wasn't him, it was somebody else. I mean, somebody else is going to take the USC job and then hire their staff. And then, it's not even mentioning all the Oklahoma assistants that Brent Venables then replaced, and then so on and so forth. And then Clemson's got to switch up their DC, there's every little thing trickles down. You're not even counting GAs and, analysts and all these other folks as well that don't really get a lot of attention. So, yeah, I mean, that's what happens when you have a seismic shift. It creates a bunch of waves, and certainly Lincoln Riley to USC did that.
It is crazy that it can affect not just the big boys, but also then others who start to have their players or their coaches taken as well. It's really nuts because that job, of course, is a blue blood. It is a very, very popular place to be coaching. They've got what they need there. They just haven't performed well. And then you look at some of the coaches involved or some of the programs involved, including Oklahoma and USC alone. Then you had the Florida, Notre Dame, LSU, and others. In 1 year, we've discussed this. It was insane, some of the bigger name programs that had opening. Oregon was open. TCU was open. Then, of course, Texas Tech was open. Joey McGuire. Washington. I don't know if we've ever seen that many big schools have openings. And then if that's just the case with USC, imagine what it meant to all the other ones as well that were people going left and right.
Yeah, it's funny. People always mention these coaches that they just leave whenever they want, but they never mention they can also get fired whenever the school wants to, so long as they've been provided with enough money to be able to pay a buyout. So, that's part of the deal too. It doesn't just go one way, but everybody's argument's always just this one single way. Like there's never any negatives to anything. It's always just like they get this and they get this and they get this, but they never, ever, ever mention the drawbacks ever because it doesn't fit the narrative. But yeah, I mean, you can make the point of players should get paid and all that without having to point directly to the coaches' salaries and the coaches' contracts and all that. They're the coach. They're not the high school kid who just joined your program who may be there for 3 years or could leave in a week if he wants to. They're under contract. That's the difference. And if you want to argue that they should be under contract as players, well, that's a whole different thing. But right now, they're not. And coaches are. And, there's buyouts that you have to pay, and there are consequences. It's not as though coaches just up and leave. Do you think Lincoln Riley's had any consequences? I mean, like his personal image has been completely shred by multiple people over the last several months. Now, yeah, he's getting paid, he's getting good money, but still, USC had to pay Oklahoma millions of dollars to be able to get Lincoln Riley, and there's just fallout in every direction. So it's not as clean cut as like, oh, it's a coach just leaves whenever he wants. It's not that clean cut, never has been, but that doesn't stop people from making that argument.
No, and look, being an assistant coach, I mean, being a head coach is kind of a different thing in college football, but being an assistant coach, if you're one of those guys like, Mike Elko, who's now the head coach at Duke, that made $2 million a year, it's probably not as hard as if you are one of the other guys, but being an assistant coach is you're kind of in a constant state of, where am I going to live next year? No matter how confident you are, because you could be really good, and then all of a sudden, you could be a really good quarterbacks coach for a really good offensive coordinator. The offensive coordinator isn't going anywhere, and then you want to be an offensive coordinator, so you got to move, and all these things. So there's consequences all the time. Or you could be a really good quarterbacks coach or a good, defensive backs coach, but the rest of your coaching staff is going to get fired. Yep. So now you got to get another job.
Part of the story, coaches tend to be job hoppers by nature, but the influx of obscene money at the top level of the sport has only accelerated the process. And one move at a major program can affect hundreds of jobs. As of this writing, Helton getting fired at USC resulted in close to 250 job changes at programs in all 10 FBS conferences, as well as FCS Division II and Division III. That's 250 different coaching changes, which if you think about it, if there's 29 or 30 coaching changes, they all have a staff of 10, right? There's 300 right there. Or no, more than, there's 300 right there.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, but it is what it is. Like, I mean, there was a domino effect, like we said. That's going to happen. If Alabama opens up next year, guess what? There's going to be 250 jobs probably affected by that, So that's probably the case just about anywhere. But I think Lincoln Riley's was a bit more unique because it was so unexpected and out of the blue. And, it sent shockwaves, and some were intentional and some weren't. But, yeah, he's definitely shuffled the college football landscape almost by himself. USC's made this big investment. We'll see if it pays off for them. I have confidence that it will. I don't have full confidence that he's going to be the next Pete Carroll. I don't have, full confidence that that's just going to happen quickly, but I do think that they will be much better than they have been. At worst, they're going to be really great offensively, and they'll be able to score points and win games that they otherwise wouldn't have won under Clay Helton. So their record just in that regard should be improved. But, I'm very curious to see how it plays out for him. Like, of all these coaching changes, every fan base thinks they got the guy who's going to, be great for them, and probably half of those are going to be busts or close to it or just not live up to expectations. If Lincoln Riley's in that category, that would be shocking and surprising, and there would be major reaction to that. And if not, and he's super successful, then we'll get USC nausea all over again like we had back in the early 2000s when that's all you heard about was USC there for a good bit. But, it's interesting just how wide-ranging just one guy moving can be to the entire, system of universities and all across the country.
It's amazing to me that every year in Texas high school football, there's like 12 to 1,300 schools in the UIL, the public schools, and there's usually around anywhere from 100 to 200 coaching changes every year, even sometimes more than that. When we come